Hello and welcome to another ViniMark webinar. Now, it is exactly 4 weeks until the much anticipated Cape Wine 2022. And the theme for this trade show is Sustainability 360. Now, in the lead up to this, ViniMark has been publishing a series of podcasts and webinars that attack this issue of sustainability from a number of different angles. Today, we've gathered to discuss energy usage in winemaking, as well as how to transition towards renewable energy in our production practices. Now, in South Africa, our incentive to have this discussion is twofold. On the one hand, we're motivated by the long-term desire to operate more sustainably, but in the more immediate term, we also need to mitigate against potential losses at the hands of an increasingly erratic national power supply. So, to help us on our way, today's panel of experts come from a few different industries, and each one will bring their own angle to the problems that we face. So we have Jacques Rousseau, who is the Global Environmental Manager for McCain Foods. We have Andre Harms, who's a sustainability engineer, but also the founder of the environmental consultancy Ecolution. Our international panelist is Dan Eggleton, the principal of the Australian-based company Venus Consulting. And finally, we have Heidi Newton-King, who is the Sustainability and HR Director at Spear in Stellenbosch. Now, as is always the case with ViniMark webinars, the goal here is to be really practical and to give takeaways that can be applied. So be sure to stay tuned and have your questions ready, because at the end, we're going to have a Q&A time where you can submit questions that the panel will hopefully be able to answer. So, Jacques, I wanted to start for those of you at home who may not know this, Jacques spent 13 years as the Environmental Sustainability Manager at Distell before joining McCain Foods. So, the wine industry. So, Jacques, what are a few of the sustainability principles and practices that you've learned in the frozen foods industry recently that you wish you'd known when you were working in the wine industry?
Yes, John, thanks for the opportunity and the question. I think, firstly, I think one of the big things is around sort of understanding in the detail of each of your processes. I think one of the things that McCain does very well is firstly understanding each of the individual processes. They've got a very standardized methodology of manufacturing. So they understand the detail around each of that manufacturing process in terms of energy usage, well, in fact, resource usage in terms of water, but very specifically on energy side. And then based on that, they've got a very planned and structured process to then look at opportunities to reduce energy usage within each of those manufacturing processes. So not just an overall understanding of the total process, the total energy usage, but within each of the individual processes. Very standardized processes, like I said, developed best operating practices for each of those processes, and then go into a lot of detail around opportunities for energy reuse, renewable energy as well. And I think that the one thing, other than obviously that sort of engineering detail, and it's something that I also take back from my time at Distell, is to start early. Don't wait until you're almost already in trouble, but actually start early in the process and look at opportunities for energy reduction first, before going to renewable energy as an alternative or a more sustainable solution. So don't wait until it's almost too late and then trying to say, well, okay, let's just move. I'm using X amount of electricity, I'm just moving to renewable. Is actually to start looking at opportunities to reduce first and then move over. But it's critical to start as soon as possible. I think it's time is not on your side. So yeah, the sooner you start with the process, the better. Yeah.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, the first step is analysis, actually, of the things that you do.
Yeah.
Okay.
But critical analysis, not just for the sake of analysis, but to then prioritize implementation, because it's a whole principle of you can only manage something if you understand and measure, but if you only measure and don't act on it, it's also not worth anything. So critical to start action as soon as possible as well.
So, I mean, so given what you've just said, when you were working in Distel, what were some of the common kind of oversights or uses, things that were perhaps obvious to you now that just didn't seem to be implemented?
Yeah. So I think if you sort of look at producers from two sides, obviously at farm level, you know, it's age-old. So if I understand soil and soil health, from that it leads you into understanding water usage and water optimization, and from that it leads into irrigation requirements. And I think at farm level, one of your biggest energy users is actually the irrigation portion. Obviously, if you're not a dryland farm, but so if you bring it back from understanding that if I optimize my water usage based on my soil requirements, then I'm actually also looking at reducing my energy side. So it's understanding the linkage between systems and not just focusing on that one element. Again, on the farm side, I think in the winery side, I think there's a lot of work that's already been done. I mean, WineTech developed a energy management guideline for the South African wine industry with the University of Stellenbosch Center of Renewable and Sustainable Energy Studies a few years ago. There's a lot of work that's been done within the South African wine industry's integrated production of wine program. So again, there is guidance. Start early, like I said before, and look at each of those individual processes, understand where the requirements is. I think sometimes we try and complicate it too much. It's the small actions, the behavior changes, understanding your individual process, looking at small things that you can do. And like I said, alternative energy. As you mentioned earlier, when we were still off screen, unfortunately we're back into load shedding this week. So yeah, I think don't wait too long and get started. That would be my takeout.
Well, I love what you said about it, kind of a more holistic vision or understanding how the systems work together. We feel like when we're talking about energy, water is a separate conversation, but they are totally connected. And yes. I think that's something that I've definitely overlooked. So, Dan, I wanted to ask you a few similar questions, if I could, given your experience within the Australian wine industry. So I noticed in my prep that the wine industry in Australia is viewed as a leader in the transition towards sustainable energy use that other industries are now seeking to mimic. What do you think as such a pioneer? What triggered them into action faster than the rest of the economy?
Yeah, firstly, thanks, Jono, and thanks for the opportunity to talk. The Australian wine industry for a very long time has been known as a very clean and green industry. However, it's become quite apparent that that doesn't sit very well when you're burning lots of coal to make electricity that you need to run your winery. There's been a lot of prior in previous instances, there's been incentives to go to a more sustainable through grant. But I think the wine industry understood that right from the start, it had to continue the clean and green image that had been set before it, and to do that, you have to actually be a market leader. You have to actually be a producer leader, adopting those technologies. Catalysing that, a catalyst to that is obviously, well, not obviously, if you're not aware, but similar to you guys in South Africa, we've been having massive load shedding issues in the last few years through aging infrastructure, privatisation across the states. We've got 7 states and territories across Australia, and the tyranny of distance. So massive country, small population, votes centred within the 100 kilometres closest to the sea. There's not too many vineyards there. So wineries and winemakers have had to actually, we've been forced into making choices to create greater security for ourselves, to generating our own energy, and then of course that adds into the clean and green. So it's been a confluence of factors, but it's actually forced a lot of other elements to rapidly improve and adopt and embrace which means that as an industry, we've actually ended up being, whether it's by design or by choice or by accident, we've actually been a market leader in the use of renewables across our whole production capability.
Well, I think that's really important for South African producers to hear, that, if I heard you correctly, that adversity in some senses led to market opportunity. You did make changes, and the end result is not only are you a market leader, but there's a much stronger narrative to what you are doing and how you're doing it. And I think South Africa may find a similar position where we're facing necessity, or out of necessity, we may find ourselves setting examples and actually having a brighter image at the end of the day. So it feels like you were obviously at the heart of the trend-setting transformation in the Australian wine industry. I wondered if, just from what you've seen and with some of the people that you work with, what are some strategies that have proved particularly effective, especially perhaps those strategies that may seem counterintuitive, that aren't so obvious?
Yeah, well, I think taking Jacques' earlier point as well, that it's embracing things like the holistic, your whole element of production from the soil to the bottling line and distribution, and trying to create those efficiencies. And one of those great efficiencies is the use of what's free. The sunlight, we get a lot of it, it's free. The wind, it's free. So utilizing those renewables, and wine industry does use a lot of water. So reticulate, recycle, recirculate. With regards to my specific experience, I consult with a group that are going into the wine industry, and we've developed a providers agreement whereby we actually fund the equipment going on the roof of the winery to allow the winery to be able to utilize the power that they generate. They don't put it back into the grid. We're using battery technology to store it. We're creating internal systems where the energy you create, you use. And when it's dark, it's stored, then you're using what's coming out of the battery. And the battery technology today is amazing. I will be, in my winery here, 100% off grid. But not only that, we'll be using our own water. We'll be using all of our own solid waste in our vineyards. And it's about closing those circles. Counter to that, there's been some of the larger entities, particularly here where I am in the Barossa Valley, that are actually doing things like Pernod Ricard have covered all of their staff car park with freestanding solar. So they're generating their own, utilising the car parking that their staff park their cars in, to then create shade for the cars, which means you've got happier staff, which then runs the winery. It's all symbiotic, and to an extent, it's creating your own economy. It's making your dollar go further, and it guarantees your security on your power. So we all know that if your winery isn't producing, if your productivity goes down because a pole and a wire falls over, or a power generating unit or plant goes down, or you're forced by an arbitrary means to be without energy, you're losing money, you're losing the opportunity. And I don't think any business can sustain that.
Yeah, well, I love what you said about the solar power in the car park. A lot of the people who've been critiquing panels, especially from the soil sector, have been saying often guys will cover large tracts of soil that could be used, in carbon sequestration with solar panels. Which again, if you're not aware of the connectivity that Jacques talked about, then you end up undoing, you take one step forward, back. So I think that car park story is incredible. Andre, I want to bring you into the conversation here as a consultant who does work across multiple platforms. When we were chatting in the run-up to this webinar, I was quizzing you about some of these exciting new technologies that are going to come into the effect in the future. And you made a comment that intrigued me. You said that many people ask about the cost of installing new technologies, but they overlook the simple changes that can save huge energy usage without any investment. And Jacques touched on this as well. So I wondered can you maybe drill down a little bit and give us some specifics in some of these areas that can be saved? I mean, Jacques already talked about water. Can you go deeper?
So we've heard a couple of great ideas already from my fellow speakers. I want to just touch on a few more. First of all, I just want to note that I don't see a silver bullet anyway. So my starting comments would really be that I encourage everyone to start the journey, to take ownership, and to also think bigger picture, not just, what about me? What can I do? Obviously, we have to make sure our businesses have continuity, redundancy, and energy and water security. But the bigger picture is really an important one. Just a quick little thought experiment. If we did our part in terms of energy efficiency or even on-site renewable energies, then there would be a lower demand on the grid, and we would have less or even no load shedding plaguing us on a daily basis. So that concept for me is a really important starting point as part of the conversation. Also a really important one, you asked about specific interventions. I'm not quite there to answer that yet, but another really important one is collaborate. I cannot overemphasize the really exciting solutions I've seen that come out of about really discarding that concept of I have to keep this as a secret, as a competitive advantage. In this game, we're either all in it together or we're all losing alone, and that's another really important concept that I just wanted to mention. And then, before any specific technologies, I think every project, every site, every vineyard, every production facility is different. So I don't really have a list of interventions in mind. I just want to talk you through really a hierarchy of what makes up an efficient and sustainable building, either in design or even in operation, retrospectively, retrofitting. And those are starting with the basic designs, the orientation of a building, the form factor, how energy is moved around, what requires energy, what doesn't, a energy balance in a sense, what demands of energy do we have, and how can we best and most efficiently and most renewably supply that demand of energy. Then passive design interventions, what kind of shading devices, in the case of a building, for example, what's the specification of our glazing, of our insulation, to reduce the loads that we have within the building before thinking about efficient technologies. And that's obviously then the efficient cooling system, heating when needed, heating, ventilation, air conditioning if we are conditioning spaces, before thinking about other technologies like really efficient lighting systems, LED. And when we also think about technologies, we have to think about the control of those technologies. There's so many smart control devices and systems available now that don't really cost all that much, but that ensure that we use the systems that we have only when and where necessary. So leaving things on, for example, sure, we can preach to our staff all day long about switching things off when they're not in use, but there is simple and effective technology available now that takes that human element out. But that actually is my next point, that human element is also a really powerful tool. We've seen some really exciting projects that have some staff campaigns of awareness, of knowledge sharing, of green champions that permeate throughout various and that doesn't just bring about increased vigilance regarding resource consumption. It also brings about really a positive concept to rally behind and build. So a couple of points there. And then I think Jacques mentioned it already, that nexus between energy and water is a critical one. Every unit of water that we don't have to heat is units of electricity saved. Every unit of water that we don't consume, we don't have to pump, we don't have to treat, etc. So a very close correlation between energy and water that'll take us a long way.
Amazing. I really picked up what you were talking about, the orientation of buildings and stuff. So what you're saying is that especially if you're going to make renovations or new constructions, that seems to be a huge opportunity then to build those things in from the beginning. Heidi, maybe we can move on to you. What I wanted to ask Andre, and I will ask him as soon as he comes back to us, is to just talk about some of the exciting stuff that's down the line. And I think one of the things to remember is that 20 years ago, people were telling us that solar energy was not sustainable, that we just didn't, there's no way to make the system pay itself off. Now that's all changed. And I think that's worth bearing in mind and all of you said, start early, to start the journey now. And I think where we are now, with solar being the solution that it is, people who've been doing it for a lot longer have benefited for a lot longer. So, but Heidi, let's move on to you for a second. To remind those at home, Heidi is the director of HR and sustainability for Spear in Stellenbosch. Spear is one of the leaders of sustainability in South African wine, even though Heidi will tell you that they don't make any claim to be leaders, and that's probably the sign that they're good leaders. So, Heidi, can you tell us a little bit about what triggered the journey of Spear's transformation towards being a fully sustainable enterprise? And perhaps then you can also touch on some of the specifics that you have achieved in more recent times.
Great. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. And thanks very much again for having me on this panel. Always so interesting to listen to other panelists and share information and thoughts, and to kind of look at the congruency of information. And I'm sure that's great for people who are joining the podcast too. So just in terms of Spear and kind of the start of this journey for us, I think that we were incredibly privileged, largely because when the farm was purchased, the shareholders had a very long-term thinking approach to business. And that was more than 20 odd years ago, where as shareholders, they were already looking at business being a manner in which you view things as custodians. You look carefully at the land, you look carefully at the people around you, you look at the community, and make sure that the business that you're in is going to make a positive difference to all of those aspects. And I think what stood out and which points to part of our journey, Dan, you spoke about it earlier, is that sustainability strategy. So when you were chatting through everything around what happens if this happens and how it affects business, I think that that's quite a critical and important mind shift for many people, is that the way that we look at how our businesses operate is how can we make them more resilient? How can we make them really thrive in what they do? And because they're thriving, there are a number of other benefits. And then, Johnny, you pointed it out earlier as well, is how do you, this is an interconnected system. And so it's quite difficult always to have conversations on one component of a system because of the interconnectivity. So you make a change here and then, there's another change elsewhere, which is either positive or negative. And so my encouragement would be just in this thinking around what we've learned and this whole journey is always taking that step back into the system thinking space and saying, if there's an opportunity here, what might happen? To realize that there'll be many times when those don't work and we experience something later and go, oh, wow, that wasn't a great decision that we made. And I can give an example of one maybe that people could think about, and not to be afraid, which is why I think it's so important in this how businesses are positioned, is that we are going to make mistakes. And maybe that's, the good thing is leaders make mistakes. And if you consider yourself a leader or not, it's not relevant. It's really, it's an action. It's making sure that things are happening. So I'll give you a quick example that we definitely learned in the production space, which I think is great, is that, and it came from a different source. Many years ago, we had a health and safety audit, and we realized we needed to have more lighting in the cellar. And so we took a view that actually we would put more translucent roofing sheets up, bring in lighting without needing to put in more energy. And so you go big tick, 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 we did that. But there's always things that happen as a result of that. And so as a result of that, the cellar started getting a lot warmer, and then we had to use more kind of air conditioning to make sure that we were keeping the cellar cooler. So reverse that decision out, okay, so now we reverse that decision out and look at these things will happen, and they're part of the process, but the team are learning. And through that learning, it's not a train smash learning environment. It's not going to break the bank. But we're learning through that process of going, okay, so we did that, we solved one issue, but we created another issue. How do we make sure we don't do that again?
Yeah. Well, I love that. Also, I mean, chatting to you earlier, Heidi, you were saying you and Jacques used to have plenty of conversations together, and that's that theme of collaboration that Andre was bringing up, is that need to, because then you can avoid some of those mistakes and kind of tragedies where you end up taking steps backward because you missed out a crucial conversation with a colleague. So I want to bring up another topic with you, Heidi, and we've touched on it a little bit. I feel like there's been little hints of this, and that is the issue of the human contingent. Now, I got to interview Moet Hennessy's Director of Sustainable Development, Stanislas Milson, and he was talking about how it took the company 20 years in order to remove all pesticides from their vineyards in Champagne. Now, it wasn't because it took them 20 years to stop buying pesticides, but it was because it took them 20 years to get every system, every department in the company to buy in to that change. And as far as he was concerned, unless they did it that way, it would be doomed to fail. Now, I gather Spear has a similar ethos and that you've been implementing changes in a similar way. Can you tell us more about this?
Sure. So if I look kind of through the history of our journey, and I'm sure this happens in most businesses, that when you're starting to implement these changes, or you're looking at this, and I'm going to put the hat on as business strategy rather than sustainability strategy. If you're going, this is our business strategy and this is important to us and what we do, often spend a lot of time in the leadership space with your managers and leaders, talking about why you're doing this and what's important, and what's, setting big goals around what you'd like to do, or smaller incremental goals, whatever that approach is. And I think the thing that we learned over that time period, number one, and this is important, Jacques, you alluded to this earlier, is when you do set any kind of targets or goals, make sure that you have some kind of, so checking your measuring and what you're measuring and how frequently and how can you appropriately, you spoke about it. There are times when you can mechanize rather than, depending how quickly can you get the information, not to just have information, but to act. So that's number one. And I think often that gets lost, is what do we do with information? We might get a lot of it. What do we do with it? But to the example that you gave, to take everyone in your team on a journey with you really requires a very different approach. And I think that's got a lot to do with, what's the context in which your business operates and what's important to those individuals. So context is critical, and letting everybody get to understand their role in this business and how in that role they're making a difference for themselves as an individual, for their families, and for their environments that they live in. And that contextual thinking, I think, is probably where we've invested the most time. So maybe I could just give a very quick example of that, which might also help, is when anybody joins our business and they go on an induction with us, we spend a lot of time actually at induction in the space around, the reality is we're in an unsustainable world currently. So, it's difficult to use terms like sustainable business in an unsustainable world. So what are some of those challenges that as individuals they're experiencing, that they see business experiencing, that they see South Africa experiencing, that they see globally? We spend a lot of time chatting about things like that. And then we go, and I think this is important, very important, is that you don't want to be stuck in a space where we're all bemoaning the status of where we are and feeling like our incremental change, is not making a difference. Then we go, what does a thriving and just world look like? How different is that world to us? And this is why I think we can't look at things as energy, water, waste, community, people. Like it's a system. And how we look at that whole system is critical. And once you get your team on board in that way, I think you ignite a huge passion in we're building a business for a better future for everyone. That grabs your passion, as opposed to reduce your energy consumption by X. Like this is business. This is the business you joined. This is what we want to do. Are you with us?
Yeah.
Important stuff.
So it's quite subtle, but it sounded like, because we're all familiar with the triple bottom line, the people, planet, profit thing. But what I appreciated about what you were saying is it sounded like if you invest in the people and planet, it's possible to trigger profit from that, because your operations become more efficient and more effective because your team is buying in and each one is implementing those changes. I think, Andre, you talked about moaning at people constantly trying to get staff to turn off lights or whatever. The emotional energy that goes into that could perhaps be better spent positively investing in that ethos rather than running around with this stick of this will happen if you don't turn off lights, saying, look at what we're building. And I think that's really important, that change management, Heidi. So Heidi, can I ask a little, we've talked about analysis a lot. Can I ask you to analyze some of your SPEAR systems for me quickly? And if you kind of had to cross-reference the cost of individual sustainability initiatives, and I know we've talked about connectivity, but if we think about a few of the individual changes you've made versus the efficacy of those changes, are there some obvious winners? Are there obvious things that you can look back over the last 10 or 15 years and go, that change is something that every single person or every single producer should be implementing?
Yeah, it's a big question. So let me do my best and see what so kind of what popped to mind first for me was that if I look at what some of those that analysis would be, it would definitely be in people training and technical solutions, so engineered solutions. So I think as an approach, if we took a lot of what we've done and measured it against those two spaces, that gives us our highest return. So the example, Andre, that you gave around kind of, when are the engineered solutions and when is it about behavior change? Critical to understand that first, because to the point where, a kilowatt hour not used is the cheapest kilowatt hour you've got, so those are simple things that go, actually, if you're just not using it, that's the start. And so a lot of investment actually in training, Jono, positive for any business, but again, contextually appropriate. So it doesn't help to train in a reductionist manner. People don't respond to reductionist thinking. Don't do it's not very inspiring, and it kind of feels like you're being told what to do, and it's not a space that people want to work in. So I do think what's important then is that when we talk about training, we're training and discussing, and it's not all formal and it's not all in classroom. It's communication and building conversation around how do we change things into this environment where everybody benefits more. So it is that thriving discussion, and it is about, if this business does better and we all do better, there's a benefit. So communication and benefit, I think, are really critical. And then it's all the running through and making sure that you've dealt with every engineered solution first. And I think all the speakers before me have spoken about many of those examples. So whether things are put on timers, whether we're looking at reticulating water back, whether we're looking at waste and saying waste is actually an asset. It doesn't have to be viewed as something that's negative. But again, if we can't do something with it, then we need to be asking, why are we getting it in the first place? So the kind of that going back to the first place spot and saying why first is your biggest opportunity. So why are we doing this? Why are we, why are we using our energy in this way around the water pump, whatever it is, asking that why. The problem is, and I think this is just a problem in business, is that we often don't find time for the why. We do a lot of the what. So that's, I think, a key part of it. So in my analysis, it's saying engineered solutions. What are some of those simple, quick engineered solutions? And some of them are happening as things break, as opposed to having to doing them upfront. So sometimes, a compressor breaks, or the compressor's at end of life. if there's been proper planning, then a lot of work would have been done into what kind of new compressor to buy, as opposed to last minute, okay, now we need to make a decision, and people default into cheapest options as opposed to a longer term thinking. So there are many opportunities, and they're small and they're very valuable along the way, that says, oh, you know, we now need to start relooking our lighting. What could that be? And to your point, collaboration around that. What are other people doing? People are generally very willing to share where things are working well. And I do think maybe a last thing is that we should be taking out of this COVID pandemic, we should, as business, be really adding a bow to our arrow and saying, as business and entities around this table and more broadly in the industry, we can see how much speed, innovation, resilience, in very short spaces of time. And so we have to get past this incremental and go action. So even for us as Spear, that's a big challenge. It's like incrementally seeing things. Actually, it's rapid change. We can do it. We know we can do it. And we've got to get together to make it happen.
Heidi, you mentioned earlier training as being one of the most effective way to pour your resources in, but you also have some interesting stories about the staff themselves giving input into how you operate. And I think you mentioned especially with things like water conservancy. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So you know, in that space again, this is what's so important. Why it's not just, I suppose, training is not a great word, because there's so many ways in which engagements and communications happen. But in much the same way as when we went through the drought, you know, again, we see speed, results, delivery, action. But as a business, we were also able to learn from our team around what they were learning and what they were doing and implementing. I mean, you've got to create those spaces. They don't just happen naturally. Everybody's in the day-to-day doing their work. You've got to create spaces where you're asking for ideas. Share with us some of your ideas around what you're doing at home. What could we be differently? We have an email address that's we can do better at Spear. You know, if there's anything that you see that you think we could do better at, let us know. Because that's the only way we're going to see some of the things that are in the operations that potentially are not visible easily to somebody else. I'll give you another quick example. So I think it was 2019. We did a fire drill, and we just felt that what was happening is that all of these key issues were starting to, it was before COVID, was starting to kind of lose their thrust. Maybe it was just in our business, but you know, there were a lot of other issues around at the time, and we really needed to hype up and make sure that everybody understood the urgency of what we needed to do. And we thought, you know, what is it that makes people rethink things? It's emergencies. This was before COVID. And we did a fire drill in the business. We got people out. And once they were out, we actually spoke about the climate emergency collectively. Oh. And we said, okay, this is a fire drill for the climate. It's not a fire drill for our business. Let's talk about this climate emergency and have a look and see where we are. So I think about how we communicate is critical. It's not coming to a boardroom and capture the hearts and minds of our teams, because then they start to feel very purposeful and that they have a role to play in making a difference.
I absolutely love that story. It's such an effective way of connecting. And the other thing that I loved about what you've been saying so far is that I think a lot of people enter sustainability or the sustainability conversation seeing human action as kind of parasitical, if that's a word, against the environment. So sustainability is about protecting the environment from human action. And what you're saying is humans are part of the solution. And I think that's really important. And for sustainability to be sustainable, we have to understand that humans are at the core of that thinking. And I think that's beautiful. So thank you so much, Heidi. Andre, can I get you to talk a little bit, because we've been talking about sharing ideas, and Heidi was talking about some things that you might miss if you don't have those conversations. So I want to make sure I don't miss what you have to say, just in your consultancy and in the fact that you're always looking forward. What are some of the exciting technological developments that are may not be economically viable now, but that are in development and that are on the way?
Great. I'll park that one for a second because I just want to latch on very briefly to what Heidi said. I loved how you framed it, Heidi. That was really insightful and very inspiring, and echoes to some extent, probably not quite on such a thought through scale for what we've witnessed and also helped with in some of our clients along the years. And what I just wanted to touch on is really that framing of the conversation. You mentioned it. I just want to re-emphasize that because while it's very far away from technology, which I will answer shortly, John, the framing of that conversation in the media is doom and gloom. In the just around the coffee table or a round of glasses of wine in the evening with peers or friends is typically very negative as well. And we've seen that obviously is important to get things off one's chest, but to make inroads into improving the scenario. I fully agree with Heidi, framing that conversation in a positive way, that there is opportunities and not just in a reductionist way, save here, save there is really key. And also not just appointing one single sustainability or efficiency manager in the business, but rather ensuring that it is everyone's responsibility on everyone's KPI card, or however you manage your team, is quite key as well. And just two examples there. I can't remember the numbers of it, but I read a study. It was a PhD study at some point in time, in the methods of asking the guests to participate in reducing the air conditioning set points or even switch. And then it really interesting one is also not just the positive framing, which had much better the results than switch it off because you'll save, or switch it off because it's better for the environment, but rather in a positively framed way. If you switch it off, then this. But the most effective way, I thought that was quite interesting, is capitalizing on the human psychology and gaming that system. So the Joneses that have stayed in this room 80% of the time have switched off the aircon and found that it had these benefits, or we have found that it had these benefits. So really the framing is a critical one, and by far that even exceeded just the simple positive framing of that conversation. So I wanted to just mention that. And then something that I've seen also, and I think that all business managers or owners will find quite key, is that this is an opportunity. This conversation is an opportunity, not just when we frame it correctly and involve everyone correctly, will have better uptake in participation of this conversation or of these matters, saving energy, water, waste, etc., but can be a really important or influential topic that gets the whole team cohesion together. I've seen it in a number of our hospitality projects where at the end of a campaign to bring sustainability into the business, general performance of staff members has been up on all metrics, from the cleanliness of the rooms, for example, to the positive feedback from guests of how the team really interacted with them. And I find that incredibly inspiring and just so useful, because obviously all those metrics just make our businesses more successful and more resilient, and over and above the environmental metrics. Okay, so that's, as an aside, I said it was short, it was a bit longer than I thought. Anyway, some of the technologies in the future. So solar we spoke about and is almost the go-to renewable energy at this point in time in various places. Dan, you mentioned that it doesn't just have to be on the roof, but also on car parks. I fully agree with that. We can find quite innovative locations for solar, even integrated into shading devices. We've had a couple of projects that placed it at the height and at the angle above windows where it provided shading in summer and let natural light in winter. So really think about how and where you place solar. Then looking beyond solar, there's a couple of the first few quite inspiring applications of hydro. The Lower Mains farm in Franschhoek has a 2.3 megawatt hydro system. There's a very small trout farm outside of Montague, has a 1 kilowatt hydro system. And there's various innovative and also quite simple technologies that one could introduce into waterways on one's property. So I find that quite interesting. One technology is called the vortex hydro turbines. Then wind has been mentioned, I believe, at a small scale. The financial scenario won't work out anytime soon, but let's watch that space as big wind farms are filtering down into the smaller scale and also into the more the less optimal locations, wind has to be higher and far away from obstacles. That'll probably also change. There's some interesting technological shifts that I've seen, so watch that space as well. But what I really want to also mention is that we don't always have to think about what's on our own property. So off-site solutions can be a really interesting one. In South Africa at the moment, where basically an off-site solar farm, for argument's sake, in the Karoo, where there's abundant sun and very little cloud cover, that can produce quite efficiently. That energy can be wheeled over the grids, depending on which grid provider we're on, if it's the municipality or directly Eskom, and that's energy that we then buy. So this financial cases of that is starting to look more attractive. The technological and also the regulatory frameworks are really coming together. So wheeling and not just always thinking about what's on site and for myself is a really interesting one where I think one should start looking.
Fantastic. So I wanted to just pick up on something before we move on, and then I'm going to ask the panel if they have any questions for each other. But we've been talking about change management that has popped up a little bit, and we've talked about the human factor. I think what's worth highlighting is that for many small producers, they're of the impression that to make realistic changes, they need big budget or big investment, and so they look to the bigger guys and go, oh, they're in such a privileged position. Whereas the bigger producers may go, we've got a huge challenge, because to make changes on a large scale with a large workforce is actually painstaking. So, Jacques, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you guys have managed change, or how you set about the things we've talked about, getting buy-in and ensuring that the changes that you implement are in fact sustainable.
John, it's an interesting question, because I think Heidi touched on it when she talked about sort of the business strategy side of things. Typically people say you have to set a target. If you all agree on where we need to get, it's easier to then work out how to get there. If you don't know where you want to go, then you can go anywhere and you're happy with that. So I think for us, one of the key things was setting that challenge, a really stretched target from a business perspective, and then as soon as you get the buy-in from everyone that we are all working towards that challenge, it's a lot easier then to get the buy-in for people to participate in the solution. Yeah. But if you set a target which is easy, or there's no target, or it's easily reachable, then there's no real challenge in it. Yeah. You have to stretch yourself. And downside in the sustainability environment is that it reaching the target, not the actual target. So if I say we want to be 100% off grid, people will say, well, that's difficult. If I say I only have to save 10%, if I reach it and I can say I've reached my target, then I look good. But actually, if you say I'm going to reach 100% off grid and I get 90%, although you've not reached the target, you've actually stretched yourself to go somewhere. Yeah. So for me, that's one thing is yes, we need to change, but the change that we need to make is actually big. It's not small changes. Yes, we can get to a big change in small ways. That's a different discussion. But actually, we need to challenge ourselves to move a long way. Yeah. But to do that, and Heidi, I mean, we've had lots of discussions, and for me, that's sometimes the one thing that we do miss. We start directly going for the engineering solution because it's this big challenge. But if we don't take the people with, if sustainability is about the way the business operates, not for the profit of the shareholder, but also to the benefit of the people working there, then reaching that goal is a lot easier. So the people part, we should definitely not forget, and Heidi's 100% correct there. It's not all just an engineering solution.
Yeah. So what comes out of that is what seems to me to be two mutually exclusive elements, and maybe you guys can help me see my way through this. On the one hand, I really love what you said, Andre, and Heidi, you said about it being a positive conversation, and talking about how we don't want to have doom and gloom. We want to be positive. But on the other side, we really, and Heidi, you said this, we need to instill a sense of urgency. So how do we achieve urgency while keeping the conversation positive? Does anyone want to talk to that?
If I may,
Yes.
talking about how you take those next steps internally, you can do it amongst your staff. You can all agree. We can all say yes. We all need to be more environmentally sustainable, and this is going to be better for my business. Your industry also needs to be on that journey. Your industry needs to be fighting that fight with you. And I don't know if it's the same in your country as it is here, but at the end of the day, business will shift the way laws and lawmakers go about their business, because they see at the end of the day, they rely on the taxes generated. Where once we can get that, and the consumer sees that your business, your industry, your people, your processes are actually not only making a glorious, wonderful thing that we all like to consume by choice, but to the long term, that isn't raping and pillaging the land, then the business by right has to work. And the business of being sustainable then changes people's perceptions, and then the journey becomes easier. And I think that's probably as critical as making sure that all the people within your entity switch the light off and see the benefit. So we've got it here where industry is going down that path, regardless of what regulatory controls are in place. It's going to happen. We're identifying it. We do know that the beast of governance is big and unwieldy. Business doesn't have time to wait for that. It's going to happen. And I think that's that cutting edge, that's the thin edge of the wedge that we've all got to be working towards.
Yeah, understanding the necessity of it all.
John, maybe I could just add something. What comes to mind, Dan, while you're chatting is, is just the importance of resilience in all of this and the shocks to our system. Because in reality, we're all facing a number of different shocks, and particularly in the wine industry. So whether they're sitting in shipping and market changes and supply chain, and there's a number of shocks that are continually hitting our industry, and with that, it's how we're building our thinking in those spaces. Because again, we can respond, and we can look for solutions faster, collaborate more. So I think what I'm trying to suggest is that we're kind of building that resilience muscle. We've been hit by so much in such a short period of time. And so how do we take that muscle that we're building and use it for our future thinking, not just, as you rightly say, in a company, in an industry, but as an industry as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. And well, yeah, that taps into the sense of collaboration. I wondered if we've got about 5 minutes left. I wondered if there were any questions that anyone on the panel had for other members of the panel. And if not, that's also fine, but I just thought I'd give that opportunity now. Nothing so far. Okay. Well, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and summarize what I think you guys have said. And then when I get it wrong, you guys are going to just stick your oar in and say, this could be said better. And hopefully we leave with some applications at the end of the day. So it felt like we started off talking really about the need to plan the journey, right? We're all going on a journey towards sustainability. We need to plan that journey from the beginning. And you can't really plan unless you know where you're going, because you've analyzed. And we talked about analysis, and Jacques at the beginning, little process. But then he went on from simple analysis. They're all connected, because sometimes just understanding connectivity can result in solutions themselves. And the example was how saving on water can all of a sudden save on power, whether it's because it's not being moved around via pumps or it's not being heated. So connectivity is key. And then I think, Heidi, it was you who talked about connectivity between various departments. Or no, maybe it was Jacques, saying how it's not, you can't just have a sustainability director necessarily. You know, you need to have every single department having sustainability at the core of their ethos, which of course in turn takes us from that into the need to get staff buy-in. And I think this can be summed up through collaboration internally and collaboration externally. And although it sounds a little bit like a Spider-Man film, I feel like the slogan that great company brings great courage, I think is really important. And both Andre mentioned this, is you're having positive conversations after work with colleagues in the same industry, as opposed to negative ones. That impetus is hugely important. And then with regards to internal collaboration, staff buy-in is key. And it was really great to hear Heidi talk about, when I asked what were some of the best returns on investment, that one of her answers was training. Because I think a lot of smaller producers think to themselves, I'm busy, I'm trying to focus on my product. Training is like, I'm going to outsource that, that's something separate. But Heidi, putting it in financial terms, putting it as part of a business strategy to say that training actually returns on investment is a very important idea. So that's amazing. And then finally, there was the thing that Dan brought up about adversity actually becomes opportunity. So out of necessity, especially producers in Australia had to make big changes in order to make sure that they were viable. They implemented these changes and all of a sudden found themselves in a position where people were coming to them and saying, how did you achieve this? You know, how did this happen? And out of that comes the ability to tell a far better story. And that story can trigger into consumer sentiment, which is a huge part of our triple P that we touched on. So that for me has been the takeaway from inception of analysis and understanding through connectivity into how humans are involved in the process and ending up with something that is not just economically viable, but is in fact aspirational and inspirational. So I would love, if anyone wants to add to that, they're welcome to. Otherwise, that is us for the day.
Guys, you're not alone. Your industry is your ecosystem. Work collaboratively, work together with it.
Fantastic. That's amazing.
Jonah, maybe the one takeout for me, and I love this kind of great company, great conversations. You know, I mean, that's essentially even this morning. You know, this is kind of bringing wonderful conversations and learning from each other. The one takeout for me that I think is really, really, really critical is that sustainability or your approach is at the center of what you do, and it's your business strategy. Yes. And it's quite a big shift for a number of people, is that it's your business strategy, but it's not a big shift for the small producers, because that's exactly what it is. It is their business strategy. And so actually it's an easier shift to go, this is my business strategy. And therefore, all I'm going to be thinking about is things maybe with a little bit more of a why than a what. And the example on energy that stood out for me with that, I see our time's up, is just, you know, what would a producer be looking at? They'd be looking at pricing and energy. They'd be looking at how do I protect myself from load shedding? And they might be looking at how do I use cleaner energy. Those are 3 business decisions.
Yeah.
But they all sit in the sustainability space. So just bringing it back into that business strategy.
Fantastic. Any last comments?
Yeah, I don't know, maybe if I just one last comment is just, and Heidi mentioned it as well, is learn from doing. Sometimes we'll make mistakes, but if we keep on going at it and, you know, confirm where we're going, if we learn from doing, we're always going forward.
Absolutely. Which I guess necessitates a position of humility at all points. So, which is a timeless value. So Jacques and Heidi and Dan and Andre, thank you so much for your time today. For those of you at home who have been interested in this conversation, you should know that Vinimark has an entire channel of podcasts that go out, which can be found under the news tab on the website, and also that this webinar will be available on YouTube to be watched at a later date. So there, I mean, just so many rich takeouts here that it feels like you can't possibly have got it all in one sitting. So now you know you can come back and view it at a later date. So thanks again for sticking with us, and we hope you have a wonderful day further. Bye-bye.